there, and welcome to our show, The Shit No One Tells You About Writing. I'm Bianca Murray, and I'm joined by Carly Waters and Cece Lira from PS Literary Agency. Today's guest is the New York Times bestselling author of Phenomenal, a hesitant, adventurous search for wonder in the natural world. Her work has appeared in Smithsonian Magazine, The Washington Post, The New York Times, Southern Living, Garden and Gun, and a variety of other publications. Her articles have been cited as notable in the Best American Essays, the Best American Travel Writing, the Best American Sports Writing, and the Best American Science and Nature Writing. She has received 4 Lowell Thomas Awards from the Society of American Travel Writers, and her work has been supported by the Alicia Patterson Foundation and the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation. She lives in the mountains of North Carolina. It's my pleasure to welcome Leigh Ann Henion. Leigh Ann, welcome to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
It is so wonderful to have you, and I'm really grateful to David Joy for making me aware of your work and for making this introduction. So for our listeners, we don't often discuss nonfiction on the show. A lot of our listeners write fiction, but for those of you writing fiction, do not go, okay, this episode does not apply to me, because it does. We will be diving into things nonfiction related, but certainly something that Leigh Ann got me thinking about a lot was about how it's our jobs as writers to create meaning and create connections and answer the question, whether it's fiction or nonfiction, why it matters, this thing that we're examining. And Leigh Ann does it so incredibly well, and I'm going to read some excerpts from the book for you. So please, our fiction writers, keep listening, because I promise you there are insights to be gained. So from the flap copy of the book we're discussing today is Night Magic, Adventures Among Glowworms, Moon Gardens, and Other Marvels of the Dark. So in this glorious celebration of the night, New York Times bestselling nature writer Leigh Ann Henion invites us to leave our well-lit homes, step outside, and embrace the dark as a profoundly beautiful part of the world we inhabit. Because no matter where we live, we are surrounded by animals that rise with the moon and blooms that reveal themselves as light fades. Henion explores her home region of Appalachia, where she attends a synchronous firefly event in Tennessee, a bat outing in Alabama, and a moth festival in Ohio. In North Carolina, she finds forests alight with bioluminescent mushrooms, neighborhood trees full of screech owls, and valleys teeming with migratory salamanders. Along the way, Henion encounters naturalists, biologists, primitive skills experts, and others who've dedicated their lives to cultivating relationships with darkness. Every page of this lyrical book feels like an opportunity to ask, how did I not know about this before? For example, we learn that it can take hours, not minutes, for human eyes to reach full night vision capacity, and that there are thousands of firefly species on Earth, many with flash patterns as unique as fingerprints. In an age of increasing artificial light, Night Magic focuses on the amazing biodiversity that still surrounds us after sunset. We do not need to stargaze into the distant cosmos or dive into the depths of ocean to find awe in the dark. There are dazzling wonders in our own backyards. And readers of World of Wonders, Entangled Life, and the Hidden Life of Trees will discover joy in Night Magic. So I live in downtown Toronto, and one of my favorite things is when we get to leave the city to go to a friend's cottage an hour and a half outside of Toronto, where we get to sit in the darkness. And I could never put my finger on why, and this book helped me be able to explain exactly why. So can we speak a bit firstly about the inspiration for this, and then I really want to do a deep dive into your process of writing it from proposal, research to publication.
Sure, I love that, and I'm thrilled. I want to hear you articulate what it is about darkness that you love, but we'll have to save that for later. I hadn't really thought a lot about my relationship to darkness before I started the journey of writing Night Magic. So how this actually came about, I have an editor at the Washington Post magazine, worked with for many, many years, and they did a travel issue. So I've done a lot of travel writing, and they did a travel issue. It was Travel Writers Not Traveling. So that was the pandemic issue. Then they had a coming out of the pandemic issue where it was travel writers writing about travel close to home. And so for that issue, my editor said, is there anything, in the region that you've always wanted to experience? This might be a great opportunity. And I said, I have always wanted to see the synchronous fireflies of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So these fireflies they're famous as a firefly can get, I would say. So if people aren't familiar, these are fireflies that they blink and sync basically, and it's a really fantastic phenomenon to see them do this. So I went, and it was absolutely amazing. It was dazzling. But when I went, I had the unique to me experience of walking around night after night in darkness, without flashlights, in complete darkness. And I found that, I had to write a pitch to have the assignment. And I remember writing something like, I'm going to seek hope rising in the form of light in dark times, or something along those lines. And so I got there and I was like, okay, we talk about light as hope. We talk about light in so many different ways, but I went and it was the darkness that I found to be this amazing respite. And darkness, I realized, was revealing things to me. And so it really inspired me. And then after that article ran, I had people reach out, readers reached out, saying things like, oh my goodness, I read this story and it inspired me to start turning off my porch light more often because, they were curious what they might find if they turn the lights out, which is really countercultural, counterintuitive, to think that darkness might reveal things because we so often talk about light as illuminating, light as knowledge. But so after that experience, I started thinking, wow, I've learned so much from fireflies, including about how light pollution is harming them, harming basically at this pretty much every life form on Earth. But so if I learned this much from fireflies, what might I learn if I spent time with owls and moths and bats and other animals, that are associated with darkness? And so in the end, it became the overarching quest really was sort of to explore their relationship to darkness, then to help me understand my relationship to darkness. And ultimately, I think it became a story about the human relationship to darkness.
Yeah, very much so. I mean, I remember my husband and I visited the Scandinavian Arctic Circle for 3 weeks quite a few years ago, and we were going specifically to see the Northern Lights, which we got to see for, I think, 2 minutes from that whole trip. And everybody was saying how depressing it was that there was never a sunrise there, that, even at midday, you could kind of see a slight hint of pink on the horizon, and that was it. And the rest of the time it was dark. And I was like, I must have been a vampire in my previous life because I'm loving this. And my parents also told me as a child that when I just learned how to walk, that I would sleepwalk and wander the house all night long, and they would find me fast asleep under the dining room table or somewhere else. So I've clearly always had an affinity for darkness. And this book is just like, yeah, you see, I was right. The darkness is beautiful. So I want to read something that Leigh Ann has written here. So she goes, to suggest that someone is living under a rock or that they're in the dark means that they aren't aware of what's going on around them. Yet most of us have little knowledge of what lives in the dark under actual rocks, maybe because saying things like this indicate that they aren't worth much. But turn over a stone in any Appalachian woodland and you'll find all sorts of writhing life forms. Absolutely love that. So we're going to go soon into creating meaning and the whole why does it matter part of it. But for now, can you take us through from when you decide to write a book like this? Do you first start doing all the research and deciding, do you go to each of the places, experience each of this, then you put together a proposal for your publisher? Do you first do the proposal, then see if they are actually going to give you money so that you can go and do all of this stuff? How does it work?
So I wrote the article. I started percolating, the idea. It's just something really profound happened to me in that process. And it really was, in a sense, to start valuing darkness and to recognize that we live in a world that doesn't really value darkness too much. The language that we use, when you really start to be sensitive to it, you really start to notice, wow, darkness gets a bad rap. Yeah, but we need it. Like we are animals who also need darkness to thrive. But so I started thinking about this. I did start researching. So start thinking about it, start researching. If you're going to attempt to understand darkness, to see darkness differently, what species might help? What species might have lessons to teach? So there is like this research process. So I started researching, thinking about species that I might want to spend time with. And then I did, at that point, start a proposal. So I started writing a proposal based on this research, really even specifically thinking like, how would I get to know salamanders? How am I going to responsibly encounter an owl? All these things, trying to figure this out, wrote the proposal, and I will say some of the things that I proposed, how I was going to go about doing it, I pretty much followed that path. A few others, things came up, there was a slight shift, but ultimately the proposal did provide sort of a map for me, which was helpful to me, in addition to, having something that I can take to a publisher to say, would you be interested in acquiring this proposal, in acquiring this book? So I did have a proposal. It was acquired on proposal. So I had a pretty meaty plan. And then at that point, after the book was acquired by Algonquin, I then went about writing the book, which is a whole other journey. But so that's the process that I went through to start the book, writing in earnest.
So, for this kind of book, obviously, you have to establish that there is a gap in the market, right? You need to establish that there's an audience for this kind of book, that there are going to be people out there who will be fascinated by this, who will want to read it, and two, that nobody else is writing about it in the same way. So, is that part of the research process, saying, okay, who else has written on this? If they've written on it, how can I come at it from a different angle for people who are writing in the nonfiction space?
Yes. So in the proposal, I mean, there are some really great guides that are helpful, but in the proposal, it starts with a sample chapter. What is the tone of the book going to be? What sort of scenes could be created? And I'm a really scene-based writer. I love that you're talking about fiction writers don't leave early on, because really, I mean, to me, great nonfiction, we're using similar ingredients. Great nonfiction has scenes. Great nonfiction, envelops. It's different, but it has so many of the same elements. So sample chapter, and then kind of going through each chapter, sort of a synopsis, the plan for each chapter, then the biography and the market analysis, which is what I think you're asking about. Yes, so that was part of the research process, to figure out, I still cannot believe that no one has written this book. It's shocking to me that it hasn't been written before. I mean, really, when you start looking at books that look at, light pollution, books that look at nocturnal biodiversity, I mean, there really aren't very many about either, but this was really unique in being really one of the first narrative nonfiction books to explore nocturnal biodiversity and the human relationship to darkness, which still remains a shocker to me. But, looking at, there's that piece, but then also, nature writing and people writing about science and all the different things that go into it. And I think that there's a real market for nature writing. I think that we crave it in a sense. Often when we talk about environmental issues, it's so much negativity. Just like when we talk about darkness, there's often so much negativity. But so in this proposal, and really in this story, I tried to focus not on what, say, light pollution is taking away, but what darkness has to offer. And so I feel like that's the tone that I tried to have in the proposal, because that's what I was setting out to do. And hopefully I achieved that in Night Magic.
Very much so. And it just shows how important that kind of framing is. Coming back to what you said earlier about scene setting in nonfiction. So there is a scene in this book where Leigh Ann decides to switch off the lights and go out into the darkness to see what she can see around where she's living. And I promise you, this was one of the most tension filled scenes for me, because immediately, viscerally, as a woman, this goes against everything we've been taught, right? So as women, you need to stay away from the darkness, seek out light spaces because they're safe spaces. As a woman, to venture out into the darkness by yourself can be extremely dangerous. And you set the scene as you are walking out into the darkness, and I'm sitting gnawing on my nails going, I know Leigh Ann wants to see night creatures and lovely things, but this is a dangerous thing for a woman. And then suddenly there's a yowling. I think, was it a bobcat, Leigh Ann? What was it?
It was a bobcat, yes.
Yeah, and I freaked the hell out. I was like, oh my God, here I'm worrying about some man in the darkness, and here there's bobcats, and there's really dangerous stuff out there. But that's the thing, is to write excellent nonfiction. It often needs to read like fiction. The scene setting needs to be there, tension needs to be there, pacing needs to be there. So, people who write fiction can learn so much from reading nonfiction, and certainly those who write nonfiction can learn so much as well from fiction. So, I want to read two paragraphs from the book in terms of finding connections and creating meaning and answering that whole why does it matter question that I was talking about earlier. So here we go. Here's one part. So it goes, there are, in my best estimation, half a dozen Firefly dialects being spoken here. Now, as soon as I read that, I got like the hairs on my arms raised, because to think of them speaking a dialect, we think, okay, they flashing lights or an insect making noise, but suddenly you reposition it as they are speaking dialects. These creatures are getting their bearings in a place that up until now they've only seen from ground level. We are simultaneously gaining new perspective of our shared habitat. In their presence, my shoulders, long tense and recently tightened by the breath of a bobcat, begin to soften. I realize that in facing the fight or flight unknowns of night, even my hand muscles have clenched. I consciously unfurl my fists to accept darkness as a gift. It was only after I started communing with fireflies that I discovered that foxfire, the region's famed bioluminescent fungi, isn't a single species as I've always thought. It's a term used for a myriad of glowing organisms that people once collected from the forest floor to serve as lanterns. And then I was like, mind blown. Of course, people would collect these things from forest floors to serve as lanterns because they're bioluminescent. That's genius. And then it goes on to say, these mountains are full of hooting owls and entire landscapes that bloom only when touched by the moon. I'm beginning to know darkness for the first time in my life, not as a realm of unknowns best avoided, but rather as a potential state of enchantment. I begin to wonder, if fireflies can be unexpected mentors of meaning, what might moths and salamanders and the other living marvels of this dark landscape have to teach? And that was just mind blowing on so many levels. And then later there's a section, it's called Watching a Salamander Dance. Before I started spending time with salamanders, I'd never considered that it might be easier to slide across rain glazed ground. I hadn't thought about how moisture turns hard edged leaves into tissue paper. I had never looked up at bright clouds on a warm spring day and wished they would swell into dark forms. But that's what happens the following day. Every hour of sunshine makes me think to myself, I wish it would just rain already. And then next page, it's well documented that bacterium in soil can boost moods, maybe as effectively as antidepressant drugs. While light therapy plays a role in increasing serotonin and has long been used to combat seasonal affective disorder with morning exposure, researchers have started sounding warnings that being exposed to artificial light at night warrants more attention for its contributing to rising rates of mood disorders. It's been linked to pro-depressive behaviors, and it activates the part of the brain associated with disappointment and dissatisfaction. Brains that process artificial light at night are known to have lower dopamine production the following morning, but given our cultural associations, it's difficult to align with the concept of light as a force with the power to make us sad. We almost always use darkness to symbolize depression and light to indicate happiness. And then a paragraph on the next page, the human relationship to artificial light is relatively new, but our relationship to natural darkness is ancient. This seems obvious, but it's hard to absorb that, unlike society's most prevalent light-dark metaphors, light is not always a positive force and darkness is not always a negative one. So just so many things that you hit us with there, Leigh Ann, that I've never thought about, that you create these connections for us and tell us why it matters.
So I also did not know these things, which is, this was not really an easy book to write. I didn't know these things. I had the concept going in, and my mind was constantly being blown. I mean, I'm in the process and I'm just like, I feel like I have to phone a friend. I feel like I have to tell somebody about this because I am like learning these things that are just changing the way that I'm viewing the world. Things that I'm familiar with suddenly become unfamiliar. So making those connections actually really difficult in writing because there were so many. I mean, I was constantly making these discoveries. So finding ways to weave those into the narrative was really challenging. And so, I mean, there's so much more than what's in the book that I just want to tell everybody about. But, that process of taking a scene, taking a narrative scene, and then deciding, oh my goodness, I want to tell people about the way that, light pollution is affecting us without our realizing. I want to tell people about all of these things that I'm learning. So, really trying to sift through that, find the most impactful information without overwhelming the narrative story. That was something I really tried to focus on. And the connections, making those connections, I think it's really just crucial to, an ultimate takeaway, hopefully, from the book. And making those connections between species, also making the connections between humans as animals. That was one of the interesting things for me. I love writing nonfiction because it really is just an excuse to ask questions. It's an excuse to learn about all the different things so that, I can use that material. There were points in the writing process where I felt like, oh, I just want to start writing. But I feel like I am in this process of like digging clay because I'm out there doing field work. I'm doing research on like it. I'm digging through dense, articles and now doing all this research. And I'm just digging clay to create this mass of material that then in the writing process I could shape into something. And, it really is a little bit like I have a friend who's a potter, and it's like I think about that. You take all of this together, and then it's like that early stage to me is really, really difficult. And you're just having to put your muscle into it, because you're trying to find a form. There's that first, when you start making a pot on a wheel, you have to use all your muscle to just get it into that initial form. And then later, you start to have the fine lines and fine tune it. And so I feel like that's a little bit what this project was. It was just massive. It was a massive amount of research. It was a massive amount of field work. And then there was the actual writing process, which was, figuring out how to make all of these connections form something that would, be palatable for readers and enjoyable and share with the reader the most refined of all that I had experienced and learned. And so again, hopefully, hopefully that's what I achieved. But that's kind of how the process was. And I did feel like I was really putting muscle into it sometimes to make those connections and to, figure out how to make it all work in a cohesive form.
Yeah, I mean, that was the thing. There was so much research that went into it. And it's not just you sitting in a library reading through, studies and textbooks. It's you being out in the field as well. And it's you experiencing it and then having to make it come alive for the reader in a way that doesn't just feel like telling, So for our fiction listeners, we constantly are talking about the balance of showing versus telling. And we're saying there are times that you need to tell where exposition is necessary and it's just easier to tell the reader. But there are times that you want them to experience it for themselves. And so Leigh Ann went out and did all of these things. And she could either come back and be like, well, I did this and this is what I felt and this is what I saw, which, would make the reader feel removed from it. But to take something that she has experienced and bring it alive on the page in scene so that the reader feels all the feels and feels like they were there and wants to go and experience that, that is incredibly difficult to do. So for those of you who are struggling with showing versus telling, don't just read fiction. Read a book like this and say, this person has taken real life and they've made it read like fiction and they made it read like a scene. And that is a skill. As well is the empathy that is demanded as a writer, because whether we write fiction or nonfiction, we put ourselves into sort of a character, into a headspace, and we've got to think from that headspace. We've got to view that perspective. And I loved how you said, I'd never considered that it might be easier to slide across rain glazed ground. I hadn't thought about how moisture turns hard edged leaves into tissue paper. And that is purely an exercise in point of view and in empathy, and saying, I'm going to put myself in this creature's brain, in this creature's perspective, to understand how this is easier for them, right?
I love that that's what you took from that, because I do feel, like with each experience that you spend a lot of time with salamanders in nocturnal migration. You start kind of think, like you're really spending time. I mean, I was actually on the ground with salamanders migrating to start thinking like that. And I agree. I love the idea of, studying other work to look at. I had a student once, he's like, how do you incorporate this research into a narrative piece? And it's like, it can really be tricky. And I think one of the keys is to not overwhelm the scene. The scene is really there to carry through. That's the story. This storytelling is powerful. And so you have the story, and the story is powerful, that's delivering information. So the information doesn't deliver the story, the story delivers the information.
And I think a challenge as well must be, so you will have experienced something, whether it's the fireflies or the salamanders, and you are writing from a point in the future at which you have now discovered so much more. But at that time, your knowledge was limited. And I think that's something that fiction writers need to do as well, is really being able to say, this character at this time knew X, and later they knew X, Y, and Z. But it's very important, as part of the arc, as part of everything, to keep it to what they knew in that moment, especially with you, Leigh Ann, because it shows this dawning of wonder, of awe, which might not have happened had you known as much in that moment as you knew when you were writing.
Yes. And so oftentimes, my process, I mean, when I have field work, okay, so say I go out, I went to an event, it was called a bat blitz. I'm at a bat blitz with bat biologists, and it's like, oh my goodness, so much has happened. Really important for me, as it has been for a long time, as soon as possible, I want to write as much as I can about that experience, the sensory details, everything I can, as soon as possible. That's something that I can return to, because to have the immediacy of that is really important to me. So if I have that, no matter how much time passes, when I come back to it, I am able to transport myself back into those scenes. And so therefore, I think it makes it easier to transport the reader.
Yeah, excellent advice there. Well, Leigh Ann, our time is up. This book it really reframed so many things for me. I mean, I was recently saying to my friend at his cottage, oh, there's nothing that fairy lights can't make prettier. Let's string up some fairy lights here. And after this, I was like, forget that. That was crap advice. We're taking down the fairy lights and we're just going to sit in the damn darkness. So it's really just made me re-look at things. And I think whether it's fiction or nonfiction, that's the best work that resonates with us, that teaches us something, that makes us reframe and look at the world in a whole new light. And that's an incredible gift you are giving to your readers.
I am so happy to hear that was your experience as a reader.
Yeah. So for our listeners, we're linking to Night Magic on our bookshop.org affiliate page. If you get the book there, you support Leigh Ann, you support an independent bookstore, and you support the podcast at the same time. Leigh Ann, we wish you much luck with this book.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
A reminder that this is an unscripted program, and our conversations have been edited and condensed and is not a full picture of our feedback or conversation directly with each author. As always, refer back to our written notes for the fulsome picture. Carly Waters and Cece Lira are agents at PS Literary Agency, but their work on this podcast is not affiliated with the agency, and the views expressed by Carly and Cece on this podcast are solely that of them as podcast co-hosts and do not necessarily reflect the views, opinions, policies, or position of PS Literary Agency. A reminder about all the ways that you can support us as a show: rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts, tell your writing friends about us. We'd love to help as many writers as possible. And follow us on our Substack newsletter. Get our stacked newsletter on a weekly basis, bonus videos, articles, essays, advice, and more. You can find it at theshitaboutwriting.substack.com. That's theshitaboutwriting.substack.com.
And that's it for today's episode. I hope you'll join us for next week's show. In the meantime, keep at it. Remember, it just takes one yes.